The office pick-me turned my job into a quiet war. I work in a mid-sized corporate office that prides itself on being fast-paced but family-oriented. That phrase should have been my first warning. It usually means blurred boundaries, unpaid, overtime, and an unspoken competition where everyone smiles while quietly stepping on each other's shoes. Was hired as a project coordinator after leaving a job that burned me out so badly I couldn't open my laptop without feeling nauseous. This new role felt like a reset. Same industry, but better title, better pay, and a manager who described himself as hands-off but supportive. I needed hands-off. I needed peace. For the first few weeks, things were calm. My days consisted of training modules, shadowing meetings, and learning systems. I kept my head down and took notes. I didn't try to impress anyone. I didn't volunteer for extra projects. I just wanted to do exactly what was asked of me, nothing more and nothing less. That's when I noticed her. She wasn't loud in the obvious way. She didn't interrupt meetings or dominate conversations. She was worse than that. She was subtle, strategic, and always positioned just close enough to power to be noticed. I'll call her Brielle. Brielle had been with the company for about a year longer than me. Same level, same department. On paper, we were equals. In practice, she acted like a permanent intern auditioning for approval. She laughed too hard at leadership jokes. She sent emails at 11 at night with phrases like, "Just wanted to get this off my plate before bed." She volunteered for everything, even when it had nothing to do with her role, especially then. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people cope with work anxiety by overperforming. I get it. But then I started noticing the pattern. Whenever our manager asked a general question, Brielle answered like she was being graded. Whenever a task was assigned to someone else, she somehow inserted herself. And whenever someone else made a small mistake, Brielle noticed, I didn't realize I was on her radar until the first incident. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are status update days, and I had just finished compiling a report I was proud of. I double-checked everything before sending it to the shared drive. Later that afternoon, my manager forwarded me an email asking why my numbers didn't match last quarter's figures. That kind of discrepancy can be bad. Not catastrophic, but bad enough to raise eyebrows. I panicked and reopened my file. I checked the formulas. Everything was correct. The numbers did match last quarter, exactly. I asked where the mismatch was coming from. My manager sent a screenshot. It wasn't my file. It was a version with my name on it, but the data had been rearranged. Columns shifted and filters changed. Totals recalculated incorrectly. At the bottom of the file history, I saw an edit timestamp tagged Brielle. I explained that the version being reviewed wasn't the one I submitted, that someone else had edited it after the fact. The response I got was polite but non-committal, a reminder to lock final versions and be mindful of shared access. No apology, no acknowledgement. I told myself it was probably an honest mistake. Maybe she was trying to help. Maybe she thought she was fixing something. I kept telling myself that until it happened again. And again. Always small enough to seem accidental. A missed attachment that I knew I uploaded. A task marked incomplete that I had finished days early. A meeting note attributed to me that included a decision I never agreed with. Each time, Brielle's name appeared quietly in the background. She never confronted me directly and never criticized me openly. She planted seeds and let them grow on their own. Around this time, Cameron entered the picture in a more noticeable way. Cameron worked in a parallel role on a neighboring team. He was on the same floor and attended the same meetings, but under a different manager. He was competent in a steady, unflashy way. He didn't talk much in meetings, but when he did, people listened. We'd exchanged polite nods and brief work-related messages before, nothing more. One afternoon, he emailed me asking for clarification on a deliverable that had apparently been reassigned. Reassigned by me, according to the message he'd received. But I hadn't reassigned anything. I checked the thread, and there it was. An email sent from my account during a time I was in a meeting, phrased in my usual tone but slightly off. Too eager and too apologetic. Brielle had been copied. That was the first time I felt something colder than frustration. I reset all my passwords that night. The next morning, I arrived early and found Brielle already at her desk, typing furiously. Coffee untouched. She didn't look up when I walked past. She never did. From that day on, the pressure escalated. There were deadlines I wasn't told about and feedback I never received until it was too late. Comments were shared in meetings about ownership and accountability that felt pointed without naming names. I worked longer hours to compensate. I checked everything twice. It didn't matter. The narrative was being written without me. By the end of the month, I was exhausted. Not from the workload, but from the constant vigilance. From knowing that someone was watching and waiting for me to slip. The worst part was how alone I felt. Complaining without proof would make me look paranoid. Escalating too early could brand me as difficult. So I stayed quiet. I didn't realize yet that silence was exactly what Brielle was counting on. The thing about workplace sabotage is that it rarely looks like sabotage while it's happening. It looks like coincidence and miscommunication, like you just can't seem to get your footing no matter how hard you try. That's how Brielle survived so long without being questioned. By the time I realized this wasn't random, the damage was already spreading outward, touching parts of my job that had nothing to do with her on paper. My performance review was scheduled for the end of the quarter. I wasn't worried at first. I had numbers to back up my work. Even with the chaos, I was still delivering. But as the date approached, the tone around me shifted. Emails became shorter and meetings felt colder. My manager started looping in senior staff on threads that didn't need them. One afternoon, I was asked to prepare a summary of my current projects for visibility. Visibility is corporate code for scrutiny. I spent hours assembling the EA document. I included version histories and links, quietly anchoring my work to proof without calling attention to it. When I submitted it, I felt cautiously hopeful. 2 days later, I was asked why I hadn't mentioned a delayed task. The task in question had been delayed because Brielle had taken it over without telling me, then failed to complete it on time. The reassignment email existed, sent from her account. No one had noticed. I forwarded it, along with a brief explanation. The response I got was a reminder that team cohesion mattered more than being right. In other words, stop making waves. Meanwhile, Brielle's star was rising. She was praised in meetings for her initiative, for going above and beyond, for always being available. She started sitting in on meetings she wasn't invited to. No one stopped her. She framed it as support. She began summarizing discussions afterward, sending follow-up emails that subtly reframed decisions. Her version always painted her as central, helpful, and indispensable. I noticed something else too. Whenever I tried to take ownership of my work publicly, Brielle found a way to soften it. She'd chime in with additional context and clarifications that diluted my contribution. She never outright contradicted me. She made my confidence look unnecessary. Cameron noticed before anyone else said anything out loud. He didn't confront me. He didn't warn me. He just started copying me on things he normally wouldn't, looping me in early. It was subtle and protective in a quiet way. I appreciated it more than he probably realized. The breaking point came with the audit. Our department was selected for an internal process review. Not uncommon, annoying, but manageable. Everyone was asked to submit documentation for their workflows. I submitted mine within hours. Brielle waited until the last possible moment. When the auditors reviewed our materials, they flagged inconsistencies, overlaps, and conflicting ownership. Most of those conflicts pointed back to me. According to the documents submitted, I had deviated from standard procedure. I had overridden processes, and I had failed to follow escalation protocols. None of that was true, but Brielle's documentation was pristine. Full of language that sounded compliant while subtly assigning blame, the auditors and my manager asked questions, senior leadership was looped in, I answered everything calmly and factually and referenced my documentation. Still, the air around me felt heavy. It's hard to explain what it's like to defend yourself when the accusation isn't loud and no one is openly angry. After the audit meeting, I sat at my desk staring at my screen, hands shaking just slightly. I realized something then. This wasn't about my performance. Brielle didn't want my job. She wanted proximity to approval and validation, and I was in the way simply by existing competently without performing gratitude for it. I stopped reacting after that. I watched how Brielle positioned herself next to whoever held the most influence in the room. I watched how she shifted her tone depending on who was listening. I watched how she documented everything when it served her, and nothing when it didn't. I also noticed how tired she looked when no one was watching. Cameron sent me a calendar invite one morning. No message, just a time block labeled Process Sync. During that meeting, he didn't accuse anyone. He didn't name Brielle. He simply walked through the workflow and asked me to confirm steps. Everything he asked highlighted discrepancies between what I had documented and what had been attributed to me. When the meeting ended, he thanked me for being clear. That was it. No promises, no reassurance. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone inside the machine. I became focused on small details. Every task I touched became traceable. Every file name included timestamps. Every email followed a structure that made intent unmistakable. I stopped using casual language entirely. It felt cold, but necessary. Brielle noticed the change. She started testing boundaries more aggressively, not with mistakes anymore, but with visibility. She volunteered to present on behalf of the team. She inserted herself as the point of contact on projects I was leading. She spoke about outcomes as if she had directed them, even when her involvement had been minimal or non-existent. Still, she never said my name. That was intentional. If she criticized me directly, it could be challenged. But if she spoke in vague references, it floated harmlessly through the room, landing wherever people chose to hear it. The next escalation came through access. One morning, I logged into our system and found that several permissions had been changed. Dashboards I used daily were suddenly view-only and automation tools were disabled. At first, I assumed it was an IT error. Then I saw the request history. The change had been submitted internally and was approved by my manager. It was justified as a temporary restructuring of responsibilities. Responsibilities that hadn't been discussed with me. I asked for clarification. My manager explained that there had been concerns about overlapping ownership and that it was simpler to consolidate under one person. That person was Brielle. The implication was clear. Trust was being rerouted. I nodded, thanked him, and returned to my desk. Inside, something hardened. If Brielle now controlled the systems tied to my performance, she controlled the narrative completely, unless I let her overreach. So I waited. I watched as delays increased and as errors appeared in areas I used to manage flawlessly. Tasks stalled because Brielle was juggling too much but refusing to admit it. Leadership started asking questions again. Curiosity is dangerous when someone has built their identity around being indispensable. Brielle responded by working longer hours and sending more late-night emails, copying more people. She was trying to compensate with volume. That's when she made her first real mistake. She submitted a report under her name that included data from a restricted source she no longer had authorization to access. I knew immediately, because I had built the original access protocol months earlier. You don't stumble into restricted data accidentally, you have to go looking for it. I didn't say anything. I forwarded the report to Cameron with a simple note asking if the figures aligned with his records. He replied with one sentence: "They shouldn't exist." That was all. The following week, leadership announced a broader process review. Company-wide, framed as optimization. But I knew what it was. They were following a thread. Brielle grew sharper, more frantic, and less subtle. She started positioning herself as the solution to problems she was creating, offering to step in when others struggled and highlighting her own sacrifices. At the same time, she began isolating me socially. Meetings were rescheduled without notice, and informal discussions happened without me. Decisions were being made inside conversations I wasn't part of. It was lonely, but loneliness is easier to endure when you know it's temporary. People. Like Brielle, don't stop when confronted. They stop when exposed. The audit findings were delayed, and leadership framed it as thoroughness. I framed it as time. Time for Brielle to solidify her own story. By the end of the quarter, she was everywhere, involved in everything and responsible for too much. And cracks were starting to show. The moment everything tipped wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no shocking reveal, no meeting where everyone suddenly gasped. It was quieter than that. It happened because Brielle couldn't stand the idea of not being the most essential person in the room. The company announced a pilot initiative, high visibility, executive attention, and potential promotions tied to its success. It required cross-functional collaboration and airtight documentation. Brielle volunteered immediately. So did Cameron. So did I. Leadership assigned Cameron as lead, citing his experience. Brielle was listed as a key contributor. I was assigned oversight and process validation. It was the first time in months that our roles were clearly delineated. In writing. Brielle smiled through the meeting. I could tell she hated it. From day one, she tried to blur the lines. She scheduled meetings without Cameron. She drafted summaries that positioned her as decision maker. She sent updates that minimized my oversight role. But this time, everything was being tracked at a higher level. Every document was reviewed and every change was logged. Brielle couldn't help herself. She started altering validation notes after approval, tweaking language and adjusting thresholds, small enough changes to slip through casual review, but big enough to create risk. That's when Cameron looped in compliance, not with an accusation, with a question. Could these changes create downstream exposure? Compliance investigated. What they found wasn't malicious intent in a single action, it was a pattern. Unauthorized access requests, documentation revisions after sign-off, reassignments that hadn't been approved, and emails that reframed decisions without consent. The same tactics Brielle had used on me, now applied to a project leadership cared deeply about. Suddenly, the behavior that had been invisible when it only hurt one person was impossible to ignore. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled, then expanded. Brielle still tried to control the narrative. She framed everything as misunderstanding, but documentation doesn't lie. When leadership asked me to walk through my role in the project, I didn't defend myself. I didn't reference Brielle at all. I simply explained the process and Cameron did the same. Side by side, without coordination, our accounts aligned perfectly. Brielle's didn't. Her explanations shifted depending on who asked. Her timelines overlapped incorrectly and her justifications contradicted written approvals. The room didn't turn hostile, it turned quiet. And in that quiet, something changed. For the first time, Brielle wasn't the helpful constant. She was the variable. By the end of the week, she was removed from the project pending review. Her access was reduced and her responsibilities redistributed. Mine were restored. I didn't feel victorious, I felt relieved. Because the worst part of working next to someone like Brielle isn't the sabotage, it's the doubt they seed inside you. When my next performance review came, it was brief. Leadership acknowledged that there had been misalignment in the past and thanked me for my consistency. I watched Brielle's desk empty slowly over the next few weeks. She didn't look at me when we passed in the hallway. I didn't look at her either. After Brielle was removed from the pilot project, the office didn't explode into gossip the way people imagine these things do. There were no whispered clusters or sudden loyalties declared. There was just a shift, the kind you feel before you can name it. Her name stopped coming up in meetings and her emails stopped being forwarded as reference points. Decisions were made without her input, and no one scrambled to loop her back in. In a place that runs on relevance, irrelevance is devastating. Brielle tried to compensate the only way she knew how, by becoming more visible. She volunteered again, she offered support, and she sent follow-ups that no one had asked for. But something fundamental had changed. Before, people accepted her presence because she seemed useful. Now they questioned it. Every contribution was reviewed more carefully. Every suggestion weighed against documented roles. Every action required confirmation. She was no longer trusted by default. That kind of shift doesn't need to be announced. It travels quietly, person to person, through hesitation and second looks. Meanwhile, my role stabilized. My access remained intact, and my responsibilities stayed consistent. My work stopped being double-checked for invisible errors. For the first time in months, I could focus on my job instead of defending my existence inside it. Cameron and I quickly stopped talking about Brielle. Our collaboration on the pilot project continued without her, smoother than it ever had before. Decisions moved faster and documentation stayed clean. There were no sudden rewrites or unexplained changes. Leadership noticed. The review into Brielle's actions expanded quietly. Compliance requested additional records and IT flagged irregular access attempts. HR scheduled meetings that didn't appear on shared calendars. She still came to work every day, but she was no longer in control of anything that mattered. The final fracture came from her own instincts. She couldn't accept fading into the background, so she tried to reclaim relevance by attaching herself to success she hadn't earned. She sent an email to senior leadership summarizing the pilot's progress, positioning herself as an early architect of the framework. It was subtle, carefully worded, and plausibly deniable, but it was also inaccurate. Cameron forwarded the ISD email to compliance with a single question attached. Is this representation accurate? That triggered the final review. This time, Brielle was asked to provide documentation supporting her claims. She couldn't because the paper trail didn't exist, because she had built her entire strategy on soft influence, not recorded responsibility. Meetings followed alongside closed-door discussions. She stopped sending late-night emails. Then she stopped coming in early. Her desk remained untouched. Longer each morning. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. I felt distance, like watching a storm move out to sea after weeks of living under gray skies. Toward the end of the month, HR announced a departmental restructuring. Roles were clarified and reporting lines tightened. Oversight protocols standardized. The language was neutral, but the impact was not. Brielle's position was eliminated. She wasn't fired publicly. She wasn't escorted out. She was transitioned out as part of operational realignment. Her last day passed quietly. No goodbye email, no cake, no speeches. Her desk was empty by the following Monday. And just like that, the pressure vanished. It took longer than I expected for my body to realize it was safe. Even after Brielle was gone, I still triple-checked emails and paused before sending anything that could be misinterpreted. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the source leaves the room, but slowly, the hypervigilance faded. Work became work again. Cameron was promoted 2 months later. He didn't change afterward. He was still precise and still uninterested. In credit he hadn't earned. Leadership asked if I wanted to take on a senior coordinator role shortly after. I said yes. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who tried to undermine me by controlling the narrative had taught me the value of structure better than any training ever could. Months passed, and Brielle's name stopped coming up entirely. Until one afternoon when an old coworker messaged me privately. She had seen Brielle's name on a job board for a different company with a lower title. I didn't feel the need to respond. I survived by being precise. And the most satisfying ending of all wasn't watching Brielle fall. It was realizing that I didn't have to rise over anyone to stand exactly where I belonged.